Welcome to the Cross Examine Show. I'm your host, Jorge Gil, and we are here tonight. We're going to be talking about textual criticism with one of the upcoming stars in the field. And we're going to be answering your questions, and we're going to be giving away books. Here at Cross Examine, we always like to bring you in and bring the scholars to your house and allow you to ask them questions. So thank you for watching. We've been doing this, I think it's 3 times this week. We had Hugh Ross, we had the ladies from Women in Apologetics, and tonight we're going to have Dr. Peter Gurry. But before we bring him in, I want to let you guys know to make sure that in January 28th, if you're around Fort Wayne, Indiana, make sure to come to Purdue University. Frank is going to be there doing an I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Also, the next day, Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, we're going to be doing another I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And then on February 7th in Flint, Texas, we're going to be doing a Fearless Faith Apologetics Conference. It's going to be J. Warner Wallace, the cold case homicide detective. We're going to have Mike Adams, the most hated professor in all of the United States. And we're going to have Frank Turek doing a apologetics training for students and parents. We're going to be also in University of Nebraska, Lincoln, in the 25th of February. And the next day, we're going to be in the University of Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska. So make sure you make your way to these events if you're able to do that. Now, tonight we have a great show. And the reason is because in the last several years, we've been dealing with a lot of people that have come up with ideas contrary to what these guys are doing. I'm talking about people like Bart Ehrman that are putting ideas in the ears of the popular churchgoer, and they're influencing people to think that we don't have a way to know who wrote the Gospels, or try to diminish the credibility of the Word of God. And we have experts that actually say something else. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to bring Dr. Peter Gurry. Okay, he is a textual critic, he is an academic, and he is the co-director of the Text and Canon Institute. We had his partner the other day. We had Dr. John Mead from Phoenix Seminary, and we're going to be talking with Dr. Gurry today, and we're going to be talking about his book. And I was sitting maybe 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, three and a half years ago, more or less. We were sitting in Rhode Island. Was it? Yeah, Rhode Island. And they were talking. It was him and the co-author or co-editor of the book. And we were talking, and they were talking about, why they were writing the book, the kind of mistakes and myths that they had found. And obviously their mentor, Dr. Dan Wallace, was there, and there was a good panel discussion. And one of the things that I remember from that discussion was I really wanted to have this book in my hand because I want to be accurate when I share this information, and I have to stand in the shoulders of giants. I cannot people like me who are just to do general apologetics. We don't have an exclusive field of studies. We need to rely on people like Dr. Gurry to give us the proper information, and that's exactly what they've done. They gather an incredible group of scholars, and they wrote this book. And I'm gonna bring Peter in so he can tell us. Peter, welcome
Hello.
to the Cross Examine live show, man.
It's great to be with you. Thanks, Jorge.
Oh man, I want to start. A lot of our audience is very inclined to the sort of content that you produce, but they might have not come across your work.
Sure.
And I want you to tell them your superhero origin story. How did you came to faith?
Yeah.
How did you got interested in theological studies, New Testament studies, Greek textual criticism, and how did you end up in Phoenix Seminary? Where did you go to school? How did you end up in Phoenix Seminary? And how did you end up, founding such an amazing institute as the Text and Canon Institute is? By the way, I'm good friends with Clark Bates, and
Yeah.
I have not heard any thing but good things about you and John and the work that you guys doing down there in Phoenix.
That's great. Well, we're really thankful to have Clark here, and we're excited for what the Lord's going to do through him. So, yeah. So if I can give you kind of the brief version of my story, I like to think that it all comes down to a decision I made right before freshman year of high school, and I had been homeschooled up until that point, and was going to high school, and I had to sign up to take classes. And the guidance counselor was telling me that I had a choice of foreign languages. I had to take one, but I could choose between Greek and Spanish. And I always had a bit of a streak in me that I did not like doing what everybody else did. And I knew everybody takes Spanish. So I thought, hey, I'm gonna take Greek and just see. So I did. I signed up to take Greek and ended up taking 4 years of high school Greek and really, really enjoyed it. And what happened in that class was I realized for the first time that there was something behind my English Bible. I think I had grown up like a lot of Christians where I had read my English Bible, had gone to church my whole life, and didn't really know much of anything about where our Bible comes from. And so when I took this Greek class, I was learning Greek and I really enjoyed it. But then I distinctly remember getting my first printed Greek New Testament. And, like any good Greek student who knows just enough to be dangerous, there I was with my Greek New Testament correcting the NIV translation, in pencil and stuff. And I just was fascinated by this fact that there was this thing behind my English Bible, right? Then I was fascinated by the process of how did we get from this printed Greek New Testament to then, say, an NIV or an ESV or whatever. And so then I felt the call to go into ministry, and I went to Moody Bible Institute. And because I had taken Greek in high school, I was already geared toward the languages, so I kept taking Greek there. And it was really there that I first discovered textual criticism. And essentially, it was like the same experience I'd had in high school, but one step further back in the process of how we get our Bible, right?
So just level up.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like, I'd had this printed Greek New Testament, and I could kind of see how they could translate that into an English Bible, and that made sense to me. But then I realized, and was learning in class, there were these thousands of handwritten copies of the New Testament, and I had a printed one. And so I just kept having all these questions about, like, well, how did we get the printed one, right? I mean, they have to make decisions about it. They have to decide where to put the chapters and the verses and the paragraph breaks and, everything like that. Even the small, tiny details have to be decided by someone. And so I was just really fascinated by that. And then around that same time, actually, that Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, came out. And actually, the first time I heard his name or saw his name was on a book. And it was the textbook that we had just used in my Greek class. And it's a very well-known book. It's kind of the standard introduction to the field. And I saw it had always been written by Bruce Metzger, and I had read it in its third edition, and now there was a fourth edition, and it said Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman on the cover. And I was like, wait a minute, who could possibly be, worthy enough to be a co-author with Bruce Metzger? Because I knew about Bruce Metzger and what a great scholar he was. And
and for everybody who are watching us, we geeked out about stuff like that. You know, when we see authors like that, and we're like, wow, man, who is partnering it up with him? That he's up there and I'm down here, and so within the scholarly and academic world, that's what get us excited.
Right. So I was kind of just like, oh, who's this person, Bart Ehrman? I'd never heard of him. So I just Googled him, and it just so happened his book, Misquoting Jesus, had just come out at about the same time. So I bought that and started reading that, and then I come to find out, he had gone to Moody just like I did, right? So I'm actually reading Misquoting Jesus at Moody Bible Institute and reading his first chapter where he talks about losing his faith and the role that textual criticism played in that. So that kind of spurred me on even more to say I was already fascinated in the manuscripts. I was fascinated in this process of how we do textual criticism and resolve differences between them. And then all of a sudden I was confronted by this person who was a really top flight scholar in the academic world who said he had lost his faith over this, right? So it kind of just solidified in my mind that I just had this dual fascination of, on the one hand, fascinated by the process of getting our New Testaments in a printed edition and then in a translation. And then also fascinated by this theological question of, do the variants undermine my faith in the Bible and ultimately in Jesus Christ, right? So that kind of set me on the path, So from that point on, I started thinking about, okay, what do I need to do to become a text critic myself? I knew I was interested in teaching, and so that's what took me to Dallas Seminary, where I wanted to work with Dan Wallace. And my dream was, even in college, my dream was if I could go to Dallas Seminary, maybe I could work with Dan, maybe then I could go on a trip with him, and then maybe I could see a real manuscript in person. And in God's kindness, I was on my first trip with him, I think within a year of being at Dallas Seminary. I was in Athens with him, and we were looking at a manuscript there in Athens. And really, I mean, once you've seen a Greek New Testament manuscript in person, that's it. You're done. You're hooked. You can't get out of it. So
you're chasing after that first hit forever.
That's it. So I've been doing it ever since. Went on to do a PhD at Cambridge and continued to work in text criticism. And now I teach at Phoenix Seminary and came here through a couple of friends who taught here. One of them was John Mead, and then the other one is Brian Arnold, who's our president now at the seminary. So, I've always wanted to teach. My passion has always been to help people, especially people who take the Bible a bit for granted, maybe because they've grown up in the church their whole life, and open it up to them. Because that's kind of what my experience was in Bible college. Was I had gone there with a very simple view of the Bible, very simplistic view, really. And all of a sudden I was blown away by how deep the Bible was, and in many cases how beautiful it is. I'd always known it was true, but I was pretty surprised to find out just how well written it is and how profound it is, if that makes sense. I'd always kind of just accepted it as true, yeah. But now it's like, oh wow, but it's not just what it says, it's how it says it oftentimes. That's so wonderful.
Right, just peeling the layers, digging deeper, getting into the head of that first century writer or the Old Testament Israelite that, in the desert and that's fascinating, man. What a story, man. What the grace of God that puts you there, that puts you in that path. I know you probably look back now and I said, look at that turn. That was all God.
Yep, that's right.
To be able to learn from that. And I got a good relationship with Dan. Me and you talking a little bit in the green room before we started. And one of the things that I told you is that, I've in a very short time, I mean, you just, you meet that guy and you love him. I mean, he really has a heart for his work and for people and for the church. I know quite a fair amount of academics, and he is one of the ones that I can see that he loves, the academic part of his work. The discovery part of his work, but he do it for the body of Christ. And I love it. Now we're talking about textual criticism. We're talking about your journey, original manuscripts or ancient manuscripts. What is textual criticism, and what do we need it for the New Testament? A lot of people are probably familiar with the term in a very general way. Give us your definition of what it is and what do we need it for the New Testament.
Yeah, so real simply, anytime you have a written work, okay, say a literary work, where the original has been lost, and what you have is copies of that original that don't agree with each other, okay, you need to do text criticism. Pretty much as simple as that. So sometimes people think, sometimes Christians will learn about textual criticism first through the Bible, right, through biblical textual criticism, and it can be helpful for them to realize that every ancient work needs text criticism for it. So everything invented or everything written before the printing press, if it's a literary work, usually it needs text criticism because the original manuscript or document hasn't survived. In fact, even things like Shakespeare, people have to do text criticism on Shakespeare. And even in some cases, things that were written after, in some cases well after the printing press, you still have to do text criticism on those because you may have the author's manuscript, okay, in his own hand, but then you have, say, a first edition, and in between those two things, you may have notes from the author on the print that he got back from, say, the publisher, the first draft, if you will. And then maybe you have a second edition of the book published at some point as well. And so even on something like a modern work, scholars will oftentimes do text criticism on it, which is an attempt to establish an authoritative text for people to read. So of course, given the Bible and its authority as God's inspired word, we want to do text criticism even more on that so that we can know what God has really said, as opposed to, what scribes accidentally have copied in many cases.
Oh, that's great, man.
Makes sense?
You wrote a book about myths and mistakes.
Yeah.
In New Testament textual criticism. What are some of the most common myths that we Christian apologists, lay level apologists, I will say general apologetics guys should avoid when it comes to textual criticism? And this is very important because I've read scores of books on the topic, and they all repeat the same things over and over again.
Yeah.
So that's why this piece of work that you guys put together is so important for us and for the years to come. So tell us, what are some of the most common mistakes that we make?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, let me just say something about why we wrote it. The reason we did write it is because apologists oftentimes have to be generalists in a bunch of different areas.
Mm-hmm.
You get asked about everything from the problem of evil to text criticism. And my goodness, are those are pretty different things to be an expert on, right? And so what that means is there are times where you always have to rely on other people for your information. And what Elijah and I, my co-editor, Elijah Hickson, what he and I realized was we started to see the same kind of arguments made over and over again in the apologetic literature when it came to text criticism. And because of Bart Ehrman and his book and the popularity of it, apologists were having to deal with it more and more than they used to have to, I think. And so what happened was they started depending on the work of scholars who weren't necessarily trained text critics themselves. And so they were in turn dependent on other people. And eventually some of the arguments began to get garbled or misappropriated, or just they were outdated or misinformed. And so Elijah and I had both just finished our PhDs in text criticism, so we were pretty up to speed on the state of the discipline. So we thought, hey, what we ought to do is put together a team of folks to write up a book that will really be a help to apologists to help them avoid some of the common mistakes that are made. So back to your question then, what are some of the most common ones? I think probably the most common one that's made that I see is comparing the New Testament and the number of manuscripts that we have for the New Testament to classical literature, okay? Usually the argument goes something like this. We have, 50 copies of Tacitus, and the earliest one of those is hundreds of years after him, maybe 500 years after him. But when it comes to the New Testament, we have almost 6,000 copies of that, and the earliest copies are within 100 years of the New Testament, okay? And I think there are really good ways to make that argument, but the way that we kept seeing it being made is in a bit of a sloppy way. And one of the ways that can be done poorly is by giving the most up-to-date number of manuscripts for the New Testament, but then relying on very outdated data when you compare it to classical works. So a good example here is Homer, okay? Homer was probably the most popular author in the ancient world, okay? And for a long time, people would cite the number 613. Well, we have 613 copies of Homer, okay? Well, that number 613 goes back to like the middle of the last century. And since then, scholars have found a lot more copies and identified a lot more copies of Homer, right? So now we know we have thousands of copies of Homer, and some of them are papyri, and they're much earlier than the ones we used to have, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So what would happen is Christian apologists would find the most up-to-date number they could find for the New Testament, but then cite just whatever number they could find in the apologetic literature for classical works, which usually ended up going back to F.F. Bruce's book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, which was a great book, is still a great book, but it's 60, 70 years out of date now. And so what you ended up with is an argument that was based on comparison, ended up being based on a bad comparison, right? And so what happens when we do that, if over time, is we actually start to make our case look bad. We start to do ourselves harm, right? We're trying to convince people the Bible is reliable and trustworthy, but we're not actually giving them reliable information, do you see? And so we can end up undercutting our own arguments in that way. So that's probably one of the most common ones I see. Another one I see a lot of is the number of variants gets discussed a lot, and that's pretty easy to mishandle that one as well. So each chapter in the book really tackles a different myth, okay? So everything from the number of variants to comparing the New Testament to classical works to a really good chapter on versions, the early translations we have of the New Testament. So, yeah.
So you got a team of guys. You got a team of guys doing this together. They all experts in their field. That's one of the things that John told me. He says, "Man, I have to be careful because I'm part of the team that was in the project,
Yeah.
and I want to talk highly about this without sort of throwing flowers at myself. But I think you guys deserve that. You guys do the fantastic work, and one of the things is people don't understand the importance of not perpetuating, continue to perpetuate these myths.
Right.
Now, tell us why it's important that we stop, we put a stop to that.
Yeah, I think it's so important. Especially one of our hopes of the book was, hey, let's not wait for a skeptic out there or a person who doesn't like Christianity to point out the flaws in our arguments. Let's do it ourselves, and let's kind of self-correct here. So, Elijah and I are both evangelicals. Everybody in the book has a high view of Scripture, and part of the goal of the book was to say, hey, we're so confident that textual criticism does not undermine the Bible, the credibility of the Bible, that we're actually willing to correct our own side of the argument. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think when we can do that, we show the world that we really are more interested in being true and right than we are in being seen to be true or right. Does that make sense? I think sometimes there's a temptation, especially when we're dealing with hostile audience to the Christian faith, to want to respond in kind and win the argument at all costs. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's even a temptation to not just want to be right, but to make the other person look bad or look silly. Do you know what I mean? I mean, this is a temptation we all face at some level. And I think it's really important as Christians that we say, no, our real goal is to be honest and to have integrity in our work, right? And even in some cases where that means maybe we don't end up with as strong as a case as we would like to have or as we thought we had, it's more important to have integrity in our work and be honest with the data, because someday we're going to have to stand before the Lord, right, and give an account for everything that we've done and what we've said. And so I think it's far more important that we act with integrity in our stuff. And what Elijah and I realized was, again, apologists don't have the bandwidth to keep up with text criticism. I mean, it's a very technical discipline, right? But frankly, most New Testament scholars struggle to keep up with text criticism because it is so technical. So the book is not intended to be a put down or a knock on apologists. We really do hope it is an aid, but to kind of make it really clear. We gave it this angle of correcting myths and mistakes and saying, hey, these are the mistakes that are out there. Now let us help you avoid them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, funny thing that you say that, because I was a lot of the friends that I follow on Facebook are apologists, and one of the guys were reading your book, and he says, "Man, I'm early in the book, and I already feel like I knew nothing about textual criticism, and everything that I thought I knew was wrong." So you guys are really opening the minds of all of us. Now, you said something about the myth surrounding the number of variants in our manuscripts. How many variants do we have? Okay, and how many of them affect things like translation and interpretation? I think that is a very important thing that we discussed tonight.
Yeah, that's great. So that's the subject of the chapter that I wrote in the book. And the reason I wrote is because when I was doing my doctoral work in England, I was reading a lot of stuff on text criticism, of course. And one thing I kept finding New Testament scholars refer to is the number of variants. And the weird thing was that they all gave a different number, and that none of them explained how they got their number, right? So if you go back 100 years, people would say there's 50,000 variants. And then 10 years later, somebody would say there's 60,000. And, another 10, 20 years, and it would jump up to 80,000. And Bart Ehrman in Misquoting Jesus will say there may be 300 to 400,000 variants. I saw one scholar when I was doing my research on it that said that maybe there's as many as 750,000 variants. Okay. And one of the things that Ehrman loves to say about that is there's more variants than there are words in the New Testament, right? And the implication there seems to be, so how could you possibly know what the original is if you have that many variants, right? So I just kind of got tired of seeing these numbers thrown around with nobody explaining how they got them. So what I did was I took 3 really complete comparisons of manuscripts. People may not know this, but we have so many manuscripts of the New Testament that they have not all been studied in detail yet. Okay, there's just it's too much. But there are 3 places in the New Testament where scholars have done the hard work to compare almost all, or in some cases all, the known manuscripts of that part of the New Testament. Okay, so it's John chapter 18, the book of Jude, and the book of Philemon. So what I did is I took those 3 works, I counted the number of variants in each of those, and then I just did a simple extrapolation from there. Okay, are you with me on this?
Yeah.
All right, I don't want to get too thick in the weeds if I don't have to, but so I extrapolated from there, and the estimate I came up with is about 500,000 variants. Okay, now 2 really important caveats to that. 500,000 variants, that does not include spelling mistakes in my estimate. Okay, and it does not include variants that are in the ancient translations like Latin and Syriac and Coptic. Okay, and the reason for that is we just don't have good enough data for that information, and same thing really with spelling differences. We don't have good enough data on that. Okay. So 500,000, that sounds like a lot. In fact, it is a lot, okay? Because your Greek New Testament has in the range of 240,000 words, okay? So think it's double that. Excuse me, I think it's 140,000. So it's a lot more. So Ehrman is right on that level. We have more variants than we have words, okay? Words. But the question is, what kind of variants are there, right? Not all variants are important. In fact, most of them are not. So let me just walk you through this a little bit. This is all in the book. It's all in the chapter. So if you get lost, you can go there for the details again. But let's look at John chapter 18. Okay, in John chapter 18, in the scholarly work that I mentioned, where we've compared nearly 1,600 manuscripts. Okay, actually more than 1,600 manuscripts for John 18. I counted just over 3,000 variants in John 18. Okay. Now, John 18 has about 800 words in it. So, again, there's your comparison. 3,000 variants for 800 words. Again, that sounds shocking, okay? But about half of those are what we consider nonsense readings, okay? They're readings where the scribe, the pen slipped or he just garbled it in writing. So it's like when I write an email and I mean to write the word the, T-H-E, and I mistype and I spell it T-E-H, right? It's something like that, where if I put that in an email, you would know that's wrong. You know that's not an English word, but you would also know exactly the word I meant to type, right? Okay, that's the kind of nonsense reading. So half of those are those type, about half of those, okay? Another chunk of them are what we call singular readings. They're variants that are found only in one manuscript, okay? So you can cut out another chunk of those. And then the lot that is left, the group that is left of that, most of those are found in maybe 2 or 3 manuscripts, and they're still obvious mistakes. Okay, so let me give you some perspective on this. All right, the edition of the Greek New Testament that Bible translators use has 10 variants marked in John chapter 18. All right, are you with me? So we had 3,000 of them, and when it comes to the edition of the Greek New Testament that's designed specifically for Bible translators, they thought, hey, there's 10 that are important enough to put in here for a Bible translator to be aware of. Now, how many then do actual English Bible translations footnote as being important enough to present to the English reader? The answer is 0. None. So when you look at the ESV, the, let's see, what else did I look at? NRSV, I think I looked at, NIV, and then I also looked at the Net Bible because it has tons and tons of footnotes. Okay, it has some of the most footnotes of any English translation ever, right? And a lot of them are on text criticism, and Dan Wallace wrote those. It still has 0. So what that tells you is of those 10 or more variants that someone like Dan Wallace looked at when he was putting together the notes for the Net Bible, he didn't think any of them were important enough to footnote for the English reader, right? If you look at a good commentary on John 18, like C.K. Barrett's commentary on John, he discusses 8 of them, and he has no trouble resolving them. D.A. Carson in his commentary on John discusses 3 in John 18. Okay, so that gives you some sense, and different parts of the New Testament will be different. Obviously, there are variants that do matter, and those are important, and I talk about those in the chapter as well. But I think it's fair to say that something like between 0.3% and maybe 3% of variance in the New Testament rise to the level where they might deserve a footnote in an English Bible translation, and maybe less. Now, I want to be clear, different variants matter to different people, okay, and different Bible readers. I sometimes in public, when I'm talking about this issue, I talk about the mom test. And I say there are variants that I care a lot about because I'm an academic and a professional textual critic, right? And then there are variants that my mom should care about, and she's what I would call kind of an ordinary Bible reader. Does that make sense? Now, you know what I mean. She's way beyond ordinary, in my opinion. She's my mother, okay? But she's a typical Bible reader, right? She does not need to know about most variants. She just doesn't, because most of them are not that important or significant or likely enough to be original that she needs to be bothered by them. Now, a scholar like me doing detailed work and trying to relate manuscripts to each other and study the history of this, I want to know about as many variants as I possibly can. Does that make sense? Yeah. But she doesn't. Okay. And then there's also a little bit of a different category for, say, a pastor, and then a slightly different category for, say, a New Testament professor like me. Does that make sense? So there's kind of these different scales of, like, as a professional text critic, I want to know about all the variants, right? As a New Testament scholar doing exegesis of the New Testament, maybe I want to know about 10% of the total. And then if I was preaching it, maybe there's 0.1% that rise to the level where I would need to mention them, say, in my sermon. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. So it's partly a question of how many variants are they, do they matter, and who do they matter to? Yeah. And that's an important distinction, I think, to help people think through, right? There are a lot of variants, right? Okay. But the majority of them are not significant. Okay. So yeah, now some of them are. Okay, let me be clear. Some of the variants are significant, and people will encounter them. The other thing to tell people always is the most important variants there are not hidden from you. They're right there in your English Bible translation in the footnotes. Okay, so if you've got a footnote in your Bible, you can be pretty sure, hey, this must be, excuse me, this must be a pretty difficult issue, and it must matter. Right. Because Bible translators by nature are pretty hesitant to use too many footnotes. So they tend to only use them when they really feel like they have to. Does that make sense? Right. So if you see a footnote in your Bible, you can usually be pretty sure, hey, there's some kind of interpretational issue behind this footnote, or in some cases a text critical one, right?
Yeah. That's excellent, man. And you mentioned the Net Bible, I think you can download it. It's an app that you can get on your iPad or your phone or whatever. And it is great. It's free. A ton of notes. It's a lot of fun as you read, and it pops up and it gives you a lengthy explanation of the reading and the words. So yeah, for everybody who might be inclined to start digging deeper in this, and hopefully they get motivated by this discussion, this interview. I highly recommend at the start. And obviously, if you don't win the book tonight, they go get you a copy. You can go to Amazon and buy it and have it at home in a day or two. So this is definitely fun. Now, so we've lost the original text, the what do they call it? The autograph.
The autograph,
right? For the New Testament, and we don't have it. Right. So I've heard people say, well, we don't have that, and we have all these variants. So is the text buried, the original text buried in this pile of variants that we have now? Is there a way to get to the original words of Scripture?
Yes, there is. Well, it's debated.
That settles it.
That settles it. Let's close in prayer. I mean, that is one thing that's debated today, and there are some scholars who think, no, we can't really get back to the original text. There may be some cases where we can't, or where it's difficult, or where we have some uncertainty. I think in the vast majority of cases, we can get back to it, and we can get back to it with a really high level of confidence as well. In fact, there's tons of places in the New Testament where there's no serious variation at all. The majority of your Greek New Testament is not shrouded in serious textual difference, right? So yeah, I think in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, we can get back to the original text. I happen to think that in almost all cases, the original text has survived somewhere in our manuscripts. There may be some cases where it hasn't, but they're pretty few and far between, and it's pretty hard to prove that it hasn't survived, because it's always hard to prove a negative. So, yeah, I think I'm very confident that we have the original text there, and I'm pretty confident that it's there in our modern critical Greek New Testaments. So the discipline of textual criticism exists to help us sort through those differences, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so there's a set of principles that have been developed over hundreds of years, and people should probably know that Christians have been doing text criticism all the way back to Origen, okay, all the way back to Jerome. Augustine discusses textual variants at times, although he's not himself much of a text critic, but he's certainly aware of the issue. So Christians have been doing text criticism for a long time because we've had to. And so anyways, the discipline itself has developed over a couple hundred years in the modern period. And we've developed some very good principles to help us resolve differences between them. So anytime you have, say, two readings, okay, in the manuscripts, the basic principle is which one best explains how the other one came about. Mm-hmm. And whichever one explains that best, that's most likely your original reading. Are you with me? So, for example, one thing that scribes tended to do was they would accidentally leave out words if the word right before the words they left out had the same ending as the word at the end of the words that they left out. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So you have the same word or the same ending. I'm writing an article on a series of these in Matthew where scribes have just accidentally left out, in some cases it's as many as 8 words, because the word at the end of that series of 8 is the same word as the one right before it, and your eye just skips from one to the other, and you accidentally leave out what's in between, right? So that's a really common mistake, and it's often very easy to spot when it happens, right? And so a lot of variants are very easy to explain, and the interesting ones, okay, are the ones where it's difficult to explain them, and that's why I still have a job.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And you're good at it. Now, before I go to the next question, I want to let everybody know we are giving away a copy of your book. We also, you got to be here. You got to be here to participate, and I'm going to be giving the instructions how to do that in between this section and the Q&A section. So we're going to have a Q&A section of the show where you guys are going to be able to ask questions directly to Dr. Gurry, and we are going to be giving you the way to enter the giveaway. Many of you already know we've been doing the giveaways for the last 2 weeks. I think this is show number 3 and number 5 or 6 of the year, so people are getting used to it. But before this, I want you to tell people what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a video. And then I want you to tell people about the conference that you guys are putting together at the Text and Canon Institute. So first, I'm gonna let the video play, and then after that, we're gonna come back and we're gonna talk about this conference that is around the corner. All right?
Great.
Here it is. Now, Peter, tell us about this Sacred Words Conference.
Yeah, so we're really excited about this conference. It's coming up in February, right here in Phoenix. And I just put a little plug in. If you're not from Phoenix or even from Arizona, Phoenix is beautiful in February. So we just sold a ticket, I think, yesterday for somebody in Michigan. And I can't blame them, who wants to be in Michigan right now? Come to Phoenix in February. It's great. So the Sacred Word Conference is what you saw in the video. It's a conference we're putting together. The Text and Canon Institute is sponsoring it. And we're bringing in some really top quality evangelical scholars to explain to people how we got the Bible. So Dan Wallace is going to be there. He's going to talk about New Testament manuscripts and New Testament text criticism. So the same thing we're talking about here tonight. He's going to go into more detail, and he's been doing this for years. So He's going to be great. He's a really fun speaker to listen to as well. People are going to love him. Peter Gentry, who is Dr. Mead's mentor at Southern Seminary. He's an expert in Old Testament text criticism, one of the very few evangelical scholars who's really a legitimate expert in Old Testament text criticism. So you don't want to miss that. And then Stephen Dempster is our other headline speaker. He's going to talk to us about how we got the books of the Bible, what we call the canon of Scripture, why these books and not that book, right? Why not the Gospel of Thomas? Why not the Shepherd of Hermas? And in the Old Testament as well, issues like that. Then we're really excited. We have 4 breakout speakers as well. And we've brought these guys in from nearby. So Tim Mitchell, starting on the right, is from right here in Arizona, down in Tucson, and he's doing a PhD in text criticism, and he's written several articles. He's in the Myths and Mistakes book as well, done quite a bit of work on the autographs and what are autographs and how should we think of those. And then we have breakout speakers who are going to talk to us about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anthony Ferguson, who just finished his PhD on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then Darian Lockett is going to talk to us about how we got some of the New Testament books that were had a bit of a rocky road to being accepted as canonical. And then Dr. Jeff Cate from California as well. He's going to talk to us about New Testament text criticism. So people are going to have a great chance to hear from a range of speakers and really get a nice overview of how we got the Bible, which I think as evangelicals, we should all be very interested in that question. So,
well,
yeah.
Man, this sounds like fun. It's 2
Yeah.
days.
It's
Friday,
2 days,
February,
yep. So Friday night and then Saturday morning, we'll have a Q&A panel on Saturday, all the breakouts on Friday night. So folks can come in and enjoy the good weather, take the rest of Saturday and go hiking or something.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I think I've been through Phoenix to do, I think I was going down to Mexico somewhere. We were doing a training down there, and you know, I'm tempted to fly down there and hang out with you guys. This
great,
sounds like
man.
an amazing conference.
Yes.
Now that we're here in the section, tell us a little bit about the Text and Canon Institute at Phoenix Seminary.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Text and Canon Institute is really a unique endeavor. Dr. Mead, who you had on your show recently, is my co-director on this, and we launched this really just about a year ago now. So it's pretty young, but we're pretty excited about how much we've been able to accomplish by God's grace in that time. So you can see there on the page, we got the Sacred Words Conference that we just talked about. So that's really a conference that's geared to lay people. This is not for academics. This is really for church people and church leaders. And then we have what we call the Text and Canon Institute Fellowship, which is a generous scholarship program. That's what Clark Bates is, who you mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Clark is our first fellow, and that's a $10,000 scholarship. It covers about 75% of the THM degree here. And for those who don't know, a THM is a kind of a 1.5 year additional degree that you get after finishing an MDiv degree. So an MDiv is your standard pastoral degree. Mm-hmm. And it's really intended as kind of a way to bridge the gap between an MDiv degree and a PhD. So for students who've done an MDiv and they think that maybe God is calling them into academic ministry of some kind, the THM is designed to help prepare them for that. So what we're trying to do with the fellowship is attract really top-rate students who are interested in text criticism, in issues of canon and related questions, and attract them here, study with John and I and the rest of our faculty here at Phoenix Seminary, and then go on to do great work, maybe in a PhD, or in some cases go on to the pastoral ministry or apologetics ministry or things like that, but to get some really good training here. So that's the fellowship. And then the third thing that's there on the screen there is our Origin conference. Now that's kind of the other end of the spectrum from Sacred Words. So Sacred Words is our church conference, church-oriented conference, and Origin is an academic conference where we're going to fly in speakers from around the world who are experts on Origen, who's a 2nd century church father, really important text critic, really important for the history of the Bible. And we're bringing in, I can't remember, 10 to 12 speakers, something like that, and bringing them in from all over the world, from places like Oxford and Cambridge and University of Michigan. And I think we've got one person coming all the way from Tbilisi, Georgia, which we always have to point out. That's the country, Georgia, not the state.
The state.
So she's a world-renowned expert in Origin. So we're bringing her here, and we're really excited about that. So that is open as well. People can tickets and come to that, but I'll give your audience fair warning that is going to be more on the academic side.
That's
for
technical,
sure.
yeah.
More technical.
So,
Yeah.
so you co-direct this with John. John was
Yep.
in my show not too long ago. He
Yep.
told us about the mailing list, and also share with us about the advisory board that you guys have. I mean,
Yep.
Peter Williams, Dan Wallace, Peter Gentry, Charles Hill, Derek. I don't know how to say his last name.
Dirk Yonkin.
Jonking. Yeah. I mean, you guys have an amazing institute here that you guys put together. So kudos to you guys. You guys are doing great work.
Thank
and
you
can also always come. You guys watching, you can always come and support the institute. These guys are doing great work, and we want to support everybody who is creating resources and advancing the cause of the gospel. Now, going back to this, now we have the giveaway, we have the conference. Actually, I had noted down here for you to tell us about this event about Origin as a philologist, and you just did. Now let's get back to a couple more questions. I know you're doing some cutting edge research in textual criticism. I want you to tell me that. But some text critics have moved away from speaking about the original text of the New Testament, instead speak of the initial text instead. How different is this shift? I mean, how?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for listeners who don't know, the long-standing goal of text criticism has been to recover the original text of a document, right? So we want the original words that Paul wrote to the Romans. That's been the goal, and there's been a little bit of a shift. Some people have called into question whether we can actually do that. Some have questioned whether we even should try to do that. That instead we should just kind of look at all the manuscripts and their individuality, and not be so concerned with one original. I think for most historians and most Christians with them, what we want to know is what Paul wrote. And there's certainly really other valuable questions to ask as well, like how was the text of Romans changed over time, and why, and how did that affect the way people read it? And those are fascinating questions to ask. But I think for most historians who want to know what Paul said, we want to know what the original text is. But there's been a new method developed over the last few decades called the coherence theological method. And that was the subject of my doctoral research in Cambridge. And the reason I got interested in it is because it's a method that's being used to edit the standard Greek New Testament that students and scholars and Bible translators use. Okay, so in really simple terms, I wanted to know why my New Testament was changing, and whether it was changing for the better or for the worse. And I knew this new method was a big part of the reason why it was changing. So I spent 3 years working on that. All right, and with this new method, they talk about trying to get to the initial text rather than the original text. Okay, and the distinction between those two is the initial text is the text from which all of our known manuscripts and witnesses descend from. Okay, so that could potentially produce a gap between the initial text as the text from which everything we have descended, and the original text that the author actually wrote. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So there's a bit of a conceptual distinction between those two. And the reason it's important to talk about is because it's caused some concern, especially among some evangelicals who think, hey, if professional text critics aren't trying to get to the original text anymore, what does that say about our doctrine of inspiration? Okay. And I think the important thing to say about that when it comes to inspiration is, in actual practice, the distinction between the two is very slight. And so the work that they've actually done to revise the New Testament using this new method, they're actually very clear to say they don't think there is any reason to believe there's a gap between their initial text and the text of the authors. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like the definition of the term initial text does allow for there to be a gap, but in the work they've done so far, they're not convinced there is any actual gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's this tricky thing of, on the one hand, saying I think it's an important thing to point out to people, but in actual practice, doesn't seem to be a great distinction so far. And I think there's occasions where as scholars, the distinction is important, and the initial text is a helpful concept. I think in many cases, the original text is still a fine term to use and a fine goal to have. So, yeah.
Excellent.
Does that help? That's in the weeds, though, Jorge. So
Yeah. That's deep, man.
We're in the weeds.
Now
But it is important.
Tonight, I'm just gonna lay down and stare at the ceiling and think about the original text and the initial text.
And the initial text, yes, I know.
And it's gonna be 5 o'clock before I go to sleep. Sun coming up. You've written on a complicated. I mean, you're cutting edge stuff, man. And actually, I was down in San Diego this past November, and you were actually adding one more to your family, and congratulations for that.
Thank you very much.
A great reason to miss ETS, right?
I thought so. My wife certainly thought so.
Absolutely. And I was hearing about this work that you're doing. It's a complicated, computerized approach to textual criticism, and if I'm not mistaken, only few people have the blessing to be able to get access to this that is called the CBGM. What is that, and what should Christians know about it?
Yeah. Okay. So that's good. Yeah. So that's the new method I mentioned that they're using to edit the Greek New Testament. Okay. So for listeners that aren't Greek students, there's two editions that people tend to use. One is called the Nestle Aland, and then the other is the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament. Okay. They have the exact same text, but different apparatus and some other different things about them in terms of formatting. One is designed specifically for translators. So especially for Bible translators, say working in Africa or Papua New Guinea or wherever else, who are translating the Bible into, a language that doesn't have it. Then the other one, the Nestle Aland, is the one that New Testament scholars tend to use. It's the one I make my students buy in my Greek courses. And the coherence-based genealogical method, okay, that is not a name that I invented. It does not roll off the tongue. It will not win any marketing awards. But it actually is a pretty accurate description of what it is. And essentially what it is, okay, I have a book on this as well. Folks want to read more about this, okay, you can. But essentially it uses computers to help us relate the texts of manuscripts to each other, and to use those relationships to help us resolve differences among them, okay? So in simple terms, it's a way to leverage the power of the computer to help us resolve differences. That is to say, to do text criticism, okay? And certainly there's a lot more to it than that. But in its essence, it uses computers to help us crunch a lot more data than we'd ever been able to before. And the burden of my doctoral research was to investigate the method to see if it's any good. And I think it's pretty good. That's the gist of it.
That's great. So, well, we're coming up to the end of our dialogue, and we want to bring everybody else in that is watching. Now, tell me some of the exciting discoveries related to textual criticism.
Yes. So one of the great things about text criticism as a discipline is that, in some, I don't want to put down any other areas of New Testament study, but in some areas of New Testament study, you're dealing with the same data over and over and over again, right? It's not like we're discovering a new letter of Paul, okay? So scholars who specialize in Paul, they're working with the same letters we've always had, okay? But in New Testament textual criticism, we often get to find new manuscripts that add to, the total number. So to take a really pretty well-known example, just a couple year ago now, the earliest copy of Mark's Gospel was published. And some of your listeners have probably heard of it because it used to be thought that it was a first century copy of Mark, okay? And if you want to read a fascinating story about it, do a Google search for first century Mark, or check out the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog that I contribute to, and just do a search for first century Mark, and you'll find that there's all kinds of fascinating backstory to this manuscript, because it appears to be the case that a scholar in Oxford tried to sell this manuscript to the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., but it was not actually his manuscript to sell. And so that's caused all kinds of trouble, as you can imagine, okay? Now, that drama itself is a story in its own, worth telling, okay? And there are journalists working on the story who are telling it quite well. There's one published in the Guardian newspaper just a week ago, maybe, that's really worth your listeners' time if they want to look that up. But even all that aside, it means we have a new copy of Mark's gospel that we never had before, right?
Right.
And it's not just a copy of Mark's gospel, it's the earliest copy of it. It's dated to the 2nd or 3rd century. And it's a tiny scrap, okay? There's not a lot of text on it. But it mostly confirms what we already knew about the text of Mark's gospel, and that's really exciting. And so we really are all the time discovering new manuscripts, okay? And I'd say over the last 10 years or so, we've probably published 1 or 2 really early manuscripts, what we call the papyri. Those are our earliest ones. So from the first, from 2nd to 4th, 5th century, published one, maybe 2 of those a year. Kind of that's about the pace of it. And then people like Dan Wallace, who travels to Europe and photographs manuscripts in great old libraries there, he often discovers manuscripts there that maybe the library knew about, but New Testament scholars didn't. Or in some cases, and I've had this experience with him, where you're photographing a large manuscript and you get to the back, and sure enough, there's an extra page that's a different manuscript, but it's maybe New Testament still, right? And it's never been cataloged, it's never been categorized, it's never been studied. And so it's just really exciting, because we're in an area where we discover new manuscripts all the time, and also where there's so much work to do and so much to learn, because there's really so much material to work with. So it's if any of your listeners are even remotely interested, there's lots of work to do, and I'd love to recruit them to help.
Yeah, absolutely, yo. So just,
but it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, just reach out to you, but directly through Twitter. Your Twitter handle is down there. They can go to the seminary website. They can sign up for the newsletter. You just can message me directly, and I put them in touch with you if they're serious. And Frank usually refer of Dan Wallace as the Indiana Jones of textual criticism, and absolutely, you guys get to travel and find, these manuscripts are treasures, man, and you guys get to digitize them and do all sorts of amazing things with them, and help us learn more. Now, just my last questions before we open for the Q&A and the giveaway. What's the best thing about textual criticism, man?
Oh man, how can I narrow? This is like asking me what's my favorite child. How could I pick just one? I think there's a couple things about it. One of the reasons why I love it is it puts me as close to the text as you can possibly get, and really forces you to wrestle with the text of the Bible. And that's what I care about. I want to know what has God said in Scripture, and doing text criticism forces me to pay really close attention to even the most minute details of that, and learn from it. And then I'd say the second thing that is really great about text criticism is it puts you in touch with past Christians who have read and treasured the Scriptures. It's really easy for us to take for granted our Bibles because we have so many of them. We can often buy them very cheaply. We have lots of good translations to choose from, and they come nicely bound, and they have convenient verses. Some of them have, interpretive notes to help us, and all this stuff, and it can be really easy for us to take it for granted. And if I can just tell one quick story to your listeners that really brought this home to me, that we shouldn't take the Bible for granted, is I was with Dan Wallace and with his organization, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And we were photographing manuscripts in Italy, in Florence, Italy. We were there for about 4 or 5 weeks, and we were photographing actually in one of a very famous library there called the Medici Library. Part of the library was designed by Michelangelo, and in fact, part of it that was designed by him was a walkway into the reading room. Okay, so this was basically a medieval library. Public libraries, one of the kind of the first public libraries ever. And when you walk in, you see on either side of you are desks, okay? And they're slanted so you can put a book on them, okay? And then at the back of the room are the shelves where they would have kept the books, okay? But when you look closely at the desks that are there, there's a little bar, a wooden bar running underneath the part where you lay the book. And still on some of the manuscripts that we were photographing was a chain connected to the spine of the book, okay? And the reason for that is because they would literally chain the book to that bar underneath the desk so that you could not steal the Bible, the book. Do you see that? It was just like incredible. It brought home to me, like, we take books so for granted and we take the Bible so for granted, but people then didn't, because not everybody had a copy of the Bible, right? So if you wanted to go look at a book, you could go to this public library, and that in itself was pretty revolutionary at the time, but they changed it to the desk so that you couldn't take it home with you, you know? And then another just quick part of that story, in that same room, the floor and the ceiling of that room were this beautiful inlaid wood artwork. And in this inlaid was designs of a cow's head, okay, like a cow skull. Mm-hmm. And we asked the director of the library, we're like, what is, it seemed kind of weird. Like, why in this fancy, Renaissance library would there be these cow skulls? And she said, oh, it was the artist's kind of homage, or his way of making reference to the animals that had to die to make the books, you see, because the books were written on calfskin, on vellum or parchment. And a big book sometimes would take, many animals had to die to make the pages for it, right? So I just thought that was like really striking. Like we take books so for granted now. We take the Bible as a book so for granted. But for a lot of Christians down through church history, they have not done that, because the Bible has been really rare for them, and even the format of the book has been something that's been unique to them. So those are just a couple things that come to mind in terms of text criticism.
Man, that is so profound, man. That is definitely something that ought to make us look at the Bible in a different way, under a different light. Yeah. That is amazing. Yeah. So,
and if I could just add to that, Jorge, I think part of it is, we can talk about text criticism and why it's important and why it matters, and obviously I think it does, right? But when we talk about the differences between manuscripts, every manuscript was at some point someone's Bible, mm-hmm. right? And any Bible you get your hands on today, maybe I shouldn't say any, but almost any major translation you get your hands on today is a good Bible, right? Mm. And we can discuss text criticism, and that's important, and I obviously am happy to do that. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is that you actually read it, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And any major translation you have out there is going to lead you to the great truths of the Christian faith, Amen. And to the person of Jesus Christ. And so, yes, let's absolutely debate text criticism and talk about variants and all that stuff, but let's not lose sight of the forest for the trees, keep the main thing.
Yeah. God tell us, that it is to make us wise unto salvation.
Right.
And
that's right.
We're privileged to be living in this time where we can actually bring this kind of teaching to anybody who is willing to click mm-hmm. on the stream and sit down here and have a conversation with us. And that's what we're about to do.
Yeah.
So before I go into the Q&A session, I want to let everybody know the rules. They're simple, super simple. Number one question per person. You guys are used to hearing me say this. We need questions, and whenever you type a question, I'm not going to go back and dig up your questions from 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago. You are going to repeat that question, and you're going to put a Q, a capital Q in front of your questions, so I'm able to find them quickly, because there's some back and forth. You guys are talking to each other during the live stream, and that's fine. But in order for me to pick out the best questions, they got to have a Q in front to let me know that particular comment is a question. Number two, concise questions. Nobody has time to be reading 2 or 3 paragraphs that you put out there, that copy and pasted from something that you've been typing away since we started the show. The format of the show doesn't allow us to do that. So make sure that you write down, redact concise, straight to the point questions, so our guests can answer it for you. And number 3, only question related to the topic. We're talking about textual criticism and New Testament scholarship in this field, and we want to make sure that we keep it in that topic. Now, before heading back to go and start screening all the questions that are going to start popping up, remember, you guys are going to have to bear with us because we're on Facebook on 2 different pages, and we also on our YouTube channel. I want to show them the video related to the Sacred Words Conference, and also say a word about the sponsors of this show. So first, we're gonna do the video, and then we're gonna come back and talk about online Christian courses and the amazing course that we have by none other than Dan Wallace. So we'll be right back. Guys, make sure you go to the Sacred Words Conference happening next month. And also make sure that you sign up at onlinechristiancourses.com for the new course of New Textual Criticism by Dr. Daniel Wallace. And all you have to do is come to Online Christian Courses, click on the Learn More button, and you will be they will send you to this page. And actually, you can actually gonna have Dan teaching the course on video, but he also going to be able to come into your living room. You're going to be able to bring Dan Wallace into your living room. We're going to have Zoom virtual classrooms, and you're going to be able to sign up for this. The course start in about 2 days. 2 days, 21 hours, 26 minutes, and 4 seconds. You're going to be able to sign up for the premium version. The premium version is the only one that allows you to interact directly with Dr. Daniel Wallace, and you're going to get 36 complete video lessons, 36 lessons and study guides, PowerPoint PDFs from the lessons, private discussion group, a toolbox, access for the whole course for 1 year, personal course instructor assistant, in-depth quizzes. And all of these, you'll get certified through Online Christian Courses, and you're able to bring the best scholars to your house. So we want to thank our sponsors of Online Christian Courses for allowing us to have these shows on a weekly basis. Now, going back to what we were going to talk about first, the book giveaway. So we're doing a book giveaway, and what you're watching right now on the screen is a way to do this, a way to do the book giveaway. It's super simple. All you have to do is text Myths and Mistakes, all one word. That's the name of the book, Myths and Mistakes, all one word, to the number 44222. That's all you have to do. Make sure you type in, you pick up your phone, you text Myths and Mistakes to the number 44222. You reply with your email, and you will be automatically signed up. They get a copy of Peter's book. Okay, make sure you text. I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Myths and Mistakes to 44222, and you will be able to win a copy of the book at the end of the show. The rules for that are easy. You will have to be present, and you have to answer when we call out your name. So if you're not around, or if you're goofing off somewhere and you come back and we've done the countdown, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you the book, but those are the rules. So as usual, let's start with the first question from our biggest platform. So we have, let's see, which platform is on top when it comes to viewers. Okay, so again, YouTube. We're going to start with YouTube, and we got, let's see, got to make sure that we are fair when it comes to there you go. Now I'm able to see. We have, let's see, QQ, most serious. Okay, this is a good one. Start with this one. Easy. Vince Artali Jr. says, using the 3% of the most serious textual variants, I will say, does those text critical issues negate the gospel message?
Right. No, they don't. So I think it's pretty safe to say that there are some variants that are hard to decide, that touch on important doctrines, okay, or that matter theologically. But no doctrine of the Christian faith, as far as I can tell, is dependent on a verse or a text that is textually uncertain. Does that make sense? I think that's the best way to say it. Let me give you an example of one that's not, or one that I don't, that sometimes is argued as mattering, and I don't think it does. In 1 John chapter 5, there's a famous textual variant there in around verse 7 and 8, where in the King James Version, we're told about three heavenly witnesses, and we're told these three heavenly witnesses are one, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, okay? And this is the most explicit reference to the complete doctrine of the Trinity, that is 3 in 1. It's the only place in the Scripture where we get both 3 and 1 together in reference to God, okay? And in my opinion, there is no credible argument to be made for that verse being original, okay? It's not found in the vast majority of Greek manuscripts. It's found in maybe less than half a dozen Greek manuscripts. It's found in some Latin manuscripts, but even then it does not go back very early. And it essentially comes into our Bibles because Erasmus, in the 16th century, he publishes the first published Greek New Testament in this early 16th century. In his first two editions of that, he does not include that verse. He gets in all kinds of trouble about this. He's accused of being a heretic because of this, because everyone is familiar with the verse in Latin, which is the dominant language of the Bible in his day, but he does not find it in Greek manuscripts, right? So he does not put it in his Greek New Testament because he's a good scholar. Well, he catches so much flack, and finally someone points out to him a Greek manuscript that does have it. And you can actually still go see this manuscript in Dublin, Ireland, if you want to. And so in his third edition, he adds it in, okay? And after he adds it in, it basically stays in printed Greek New Testament for the next century. And when the translators of the King James Version come to translate, they are translating from a printed edition that has it in there. Are you with me? Okay. However, it does not belong in our Bibles, in my opinion. Okay, and it is not in your Bibles if you have a modern translation. Even if you have anything besides, say, the King James or the New King James, you will not find it in there except in a footnote, maybe. Now, here's the remarkable thing. That verse is not found in a Greek manuscript until, really, the Middle Ages, okay? And yet, somehow, in the great creeds of the Christian faith, we have very clear articulations of the doctrine of the Trinity, okay? And how is it that we have that? And the reason is because they did not need that verse to work through and work out the doctrine of the Trinity. Why? Because they did it from all of Scripture, not from one verse. Okay? And theology at its best is always done not from one verse, but from what Paul calls in the book of Acts, the whole counsel of God. Amen. Right? And so, no, as far as I'm concerned, there is no doctrine that is in any kind of doubt because of textual criticism, but that's not to say there are no variants that don't touch on doctrine, if I can put it that way. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. I got, let's see, well, let's move in here. I got one by Dustin Summers. Said, and I don't know if this is your area, but it's a fun one. It's always in my head, and I just like to hear what people's got to say about this, especially you guys that invest so much of your time doing this. And it is, who do you believe wrote the book of Hebrews? And that is, the $1 million question, right?
Yes. Right. So, okay, I'm going to tie this to text criticism, since that is what we're talking about. Yeah. I will tell you what most scribes thought. Most scribes thought that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, right? And most theologians in the early church thought that Paul did, and it was not until later that people started to think that Paul didn't write it. Even Origen, who's the subject of our conference coming up in November, the Origen Colloquium, Origen is often cited as having thought that he didn't know who wrote it. Well, if you read Origen carefully, actually what he says is he doesn't know who put pen to the parchment, but he thinks Paul is the one behind it. In other words, he thinks Paul had like an amanuensis or somebody else write it for him, but it's Paul who's the one behind it, right? Now, the thing about Hebrews, of course, is he doesn't actually tell us who the author is. So unlike all of the other Pauline letters in your New Testament, Hebrews does not say who's writing it, okay? Okay, so who do I think? I don't know who wrote it. I have no idea.
No idea.
I have
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
But I will
I
say
was
this.
waiting for you to tell me, well, it's
Yeah,
such and
yeah.
such. And that's good.
No, I
It's
don't
good.
know.
One of the things that I think we as Christians need to learn, and this is something I've been stressing this past week, is, when we don't know, we don't know.
Right,
I mean,
right,
Jesus rose from the dead,
right.
game over.
Yeah,
And then we're left with this embarrassment of riches when it comes to the text of the New Testament, the incredible amount of manuscripts that we have, and the countless hours that we can sit down. I mean,
yeah.
I bet you wish there were more hours in the day so you can just do
Sleep.
what you do best, man.
So I could
That's fantastic.
sleep. So I could sleep.
Oh,
34
that
hours a day
also
I
too.
sleep.
Yeah, sleep a little bit. Yeah. Actually, we got another question here. It says, as everyday Christians who want to share our faith, how would you concisely approach textual criticism questions that come up from skeptics in everyday conversation? Thank you and God bless.
Right. Well, okay. That's a good question, but it's not a fair one because I would never do it concisely because I do this for a living. So if someone were to ask me
Right.
about it, they would get a very long answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
But how would I do it concisely? Okay. Well, let's say my kids ask me about it, who they generally don't care about text criticism at all. Okay. I would say something like, um, the text of the New Testament is remarkably stable across time. There are a lot of differences, but it's remarkably stable across time. And in fact, given the number of times that it was copied by hand, the number of variants, in my opinion, is actually relatively small. So if I go back to the John 18 example, and this is probably the example I would use with somebody on the street, is the number of times that we know of that scribes copy John 18 is about 1,600 times, right? So if John chapter 18 has about 800 words in that chapter, that means in total, scribes copied about 1.3 million words.
Mm.
Does that make sense? 1.3 million words. And out of that, we have about 3,000 distinct variants. Okay? So 1.3 million words copied and 3,000 distinct variants. That's not that many because you think every single word that they copied presented an opportunity for them to make a mistake,
Make a mistake, yeah.
right? Because they're copying by hand. And so every time you're copying another word, that's another potential opportunity, right, for a mistake. And in fact, they only created a new variant 3,000 times, right? And so if you do the math on that, it comes out to one distinct variant for every 400 words they copied, okay? And the other important thing is every single copy that we have, and in some cases, even every variant that we have, helps us resolve the variants, right? So the variants themselves help us understand better how scribes did their work and how they made mistakes when they did it. And that actually gives us greater confidence when we do encounter the differences to help resolve them. Does that make sense? Because we have so many copies, we can see, oh, look, I keep seeing the same mistake made over and over and over again. So when I come to this one particular point where I'm having trouble deciding between two differences, well, I know that scribes tend to make this mistake more often than that one. So at this point, it's more likely that this one is original and that one's not. Does that make sense? So in a way, the problem actually helps become its own solution.
Interesting. That's a good way to put it, man. Got another one here by the Synagogue, I think. It says, does acceptance of Markan priority leave Christians open to fallacious claims like something related to the New Testament evolution and the Q hypothesis?
Wow. Okay. Real simply, so for those who haven't heard that term before, Markan priority means the belief that Mark is the first gospel to write. Okay. I'd say some kind of majority of New Testament scholars think that Mark wrote first. That's usually a combination of arguments that include things like he's the shortest. He tends to not have things that the others have, so he doesn't have a birth narrative account like Luke has, right, and that Matthew has. So things like that. Then there's other reasons as well. Okay, so that's the belief that Mark wrote earlier. Now, what's the rest of the question? Does that undermine us somehow?
Okay. Yeah. So let me go back to it. We find it right here. It says, does the whole Markan priority will leave Christians open to, false claims like the New Testament evolved
Oh, I see.
or in the Q hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I could distinguish those: the idea of the New Testament evolved, and then the Q hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
The Q hypothesis is an attempt to explain the pretty remarkable verbal agreement between Matthew and Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Q is basically the document that's thought to be behind the agreements of Matthew and Luke. But I think most Christians, with the exception of some, like St. Augustine in the past, most Christians have thought that some of the gospel writers used some of the other gospel writers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Mark used Luke. Some people think, well, I don't know if people think that, but people think maybe Matthew used Mark. Some people, not as many people, think that maybe Mark used Matthew, or et cetera. Okay. That's, as far as I can see, that's not a problem for Christian faith at all.
Mm-hmm.
So if Matthew, let's say, can use Mark's gospel, why couldn't Matthew also use Q?
Right.
And sometimes this misunderstanding is because people think that inspiration means the New Testament writers locked themselves in their closet, and waited for the voice to speak to them, and then they began writing every word that they heard.
Right.
But no, not really.
Yeah,
right?
and
they use sources.
And to speak to that, one of the things that I think we all should know as Christians is that we need to do away with this, sort of, I would say, fantastic view of the writers getting in the trance and getting the words downloaded into their mind somehow, and completely divorcing the process from the humanity of the authors or the way that written words work, right? I think that is we build a glass house.
Yes.
And then when somebody like Ehrman says something,
yes,
and we're completely vulnerable because we've been walking around with glass slippers and we've just have this fantastic view of inspiration that's really not even what we find in the scriptures. So I think that is very true, man. That is great. I got another one here, and actually I'm going to take care of Dustin. This is the second question from Dustin. He says, which Bible version? It's and you said that most, if not all, are English versions, and I understand that you're not talking about something like the New World Translation.
Right. There are limits.
The Jehovah Witness deal, right? But
yes,
most up-to-date current translations, he says, in the English language, what is the best one for study purposes? And
that's good. For study purposes, that's a good question, because it's helpful to be more specific than just what's the best one, right? Like I said, we're blessed to have a lot of good ones, a number of good ones. Personally, I like to use the ESV myself because it tends to be close to the original languages without being awkward English. So for a while I tried to use the NASB, and I found the NASB was very literal, very close to the original languages, but the English was pretty awkward at points. Although your listeners may not know, but they are revising the NASB right now, in fact. What else? So I personally like the ESV. The Net Bible is pretty good for study because it's got all those notes, and they can be super helpful. I found that when I was in seminary, and had to do homework for class, the questions on my homework was almost always anticipated in the notes in the Net Bible.
Bible. That's great, man.
You can, in a lot of ways, you can get a decent seminary education, at least the base level, by reading those Net Bible notes. You may not always be able to.
It's like your professor Dan Wallace just giving you the answers right there.
And what I realized later, of course, is actually the Net Bible notes were written mostly by Dallas Seminary profs. So it turned out actually my professors had written the notes.
Yeah,
but
that's great.
But still,
man.
they're really informative, and you can get actually quite a lot of detail in them. Yeah.
Again, you can get that in digital version, completely free. I mean, avail yourself. That resource is great. I got another one here. It says, User says, what features determine a manuscript to be the best manuscript, or what makes some manuscripts better than others?
Yes, that's a great question. Okay, so in general, all things being equal, there's an assumption that earlier is better. Okay, so a 4th century manuscript generally speaking, we could consider would be better than a later, say, 9th, 10th, 12th, 13th century manuscript. Okay, that's not always true though, because a 13th century manuscript might have been made from a very good 2nd or 3rd century copy, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas, say, a 4th or 5th century copy might have been copied by some really lousy scribe or by somebody who decided to put his own ideas in there, And in that case, it's an early manuscript, but a very bad text. Okay. So really the question is not so much how old is the parchment, although that is important, but beyond that, then we need to ask how good is the text that it preserves. And essentially the way we do that is by doing text criticism. We take manuscripts and we compare the text that they have, and we say, in each place where they differ, which one is more likely to have the earlier reading, right? And then the manuscript that has the earlier reading more often than the other one is overall a better manuscript. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
One of the great things that's happened in the last, I'd say 10, 15 years is a real concerted effort to study particular manuscripts in a lot of detail and learn their kind of idiosyncrasies. So a good friend of mine at Cambridge did his dissertation on one of the earliest substantial copies of the book of Revelation. He spent 3 years just looking at that copy of Revelation. And he was able to do some really good detailed work understanding the kind of mistakes that particular scribe was prone to. One of the fun things that he was able to determine was that the scribe, when he would re-ink his pen, his pen, re-ink his reed pen, there were times where you could see that he had made a mistake right at the point where he had to lift the pen to re-ink it and then come back to his manuscript, you see? And so there are things like that where we can, a really close and careful study of manuscripts can help us understand the quality of the text even better. My co-editor, Elijah Hickson, spent his dissertation time working on a set of really interesting manuscripts from, I think, the 6th century that are actually dyed purple. And then the ink is written in some cases in gold lettering. Extremely fancy manuscripts. And so he has published his dissertation now on those. So yeah, there's a lot to be learned from each manuscript. Each manuscript has its own kind of, sometimes I say its own story to tell, and its own type of text.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic, man. Well, I'm going to ask the last question before we um, give away the book and then go to
Yeah.
bed. Okay. So,
Yes.
um, what tools are out there available for people to um, get their toes wet in textual criticism and really I would say a meaningful study
Yeah.
in relation to your area of expertise.
Yeah. So let me think what the kind of the best short introduction is. If you don't know Greek, there's not as many, and you'll be a bit more limited in what you can read. If you can work through some Greek, or even if you don't know Greek, but you're willing to read a good book on it, I think Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman's book, The Text of the New Testament, is still one of the best introductions. It's dated in some places, and there's some places where I certainly disagree with things, especially where Ehrman has added some things in the 4th edition. But it's still a great book, really good introduction to the subject. Um, Another one, honestly, I will recommend is Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus. Um, again, the book is kind of framed in a way that I think is unhelpful, and I don't think his theological conclusions at all need to follow from things, and there's some exaggerations. But a lot of the book is just really helpful, very clear introduction to text criticism. So it tends to be sensationalized, but
Mm-hmm.
if you're willing to kind of deal with that, it can actually be a helpful introduction to it. You might want to read it alongside. If you just Google Dan Wallace's book review of it, you might want to read that along with it. But
Right.
it's very accessible, and honestly, I don't know. I'm not familiar with anything that's more accessible than that. Although I'll say one other one that is pretty good in terms of accessibility, and it doesn't have the skepticism of Ehrman, is Dan Wallace's book with Ed Komashevsky, and there's a third guy whose name escapes me, but it's called Reinventing Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
You may have heard that, Jorge. The first third of that book, I want to say, is all about text criticism. It's written by Dan, and that's really, really helpful as
That's
well.
good stuff. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
either that's
Fantastic. And let's say digital study resources, something like Logos or accordance
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. If you want to kind of jump in the deep end, you can follow along at the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog. There's a little bit of a learning curve for that because we be discussing academic stuff, and sometimes we tend to assume stuff. But there's a lot of stuff, a lot of material on that website, and that'll give you a sense. If you start reading that blog, you'll get a real good sense of where the discipline is at today and what text critics are talking about, and things like the first century Mark fragment, or maybe your listeners heard about the Gospel of Jesus' wife fragment.
Mm-hmm.
The Evangelical Text Criticism blog has been following those very closely, and in some cases has been kind of leading the discussion on some of those issues. So
Yeah.
it's a great place to follow along for even breaking news sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I know our audience like that kind of stuff, man. I'm sure that they're gonna
Yeah.
go there. Just gonna put all the links in the description, especially for the Facebook and YouTube streams. I'm gonna
Yeah.
have all your information there. People can follow you on Twitter, and now it's time to give away stuff, man.
All right. Yes.
Let's give away stuff. So let me go ahead on and refresh the page to see how many people we have. And then I'm going to give you a number. One of the things that I want to tell people is I'm going to give you another 60 seconds to sign up for this. We have, let's see how many people we got. Okay, so let's see if we can make it a 20. Just to make it
Oh,
fun.
can I?
Okay.
1 to 20.
Yeah, let's see.
All right.
Well,
Let me
but
put
not
it.
yet.
Let me put
But
it on plug. Oh, not
not
yet.
yet.
Okay.
Not
Sorry.
yet. Just give me a minute. I want to
Okay.
make sure that we are good to go when it comes to this. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna play the video once again. We're gonna do the video once again, and then we're gonna come back. I'm gonna refresh my screen once again, and then
All right. Then we'll do
I'm
it.
gonna give
Okay.
you the number.
All right.
Hopefully it'll be between 1 and 20. Right now it'll be between 1 and 15, but I'll let you know.
Okay.
We'll be right back.
All right.
All right, and that was it. I'm going to refresh
All
my
right.
screen. We're back, and let's see if we have any more people entering the giveaway. So we're going to give a copy of Myths and Mistakes of New Testament Textual Criticism. And
Draw attention to the losers too much. But for the losers, on the Evangelical Text Criticism blog, we're going to be giving away some copies there as well in the next week or so. So if you don't win, I hope you do. But if you don't win, look out for that as well.
yeah, and and for those who they're happy losers, they can actually go to Amazon.
This is true.
Yeah,
This is
and
true.
get a copy. Like
Yeah.
I said, you'll have it
Yeah.
in a day or two. Sometimes,
Yeah.
actually, the last we did give away one when John was on the show,
Yeah.
and we send it off, I mean, the winner had it in within 24 hours, so
There
you
you
can
go.
get your hands in the book right away. So it's a
There you
number
go.
from between 1 and 16, man. So
All right.
just
1 and
give me,
16.
yeah.
Gonna pick my favorite number, which is 13.
13.
Yep.
We had it was funny because we had two people from Reasons to Believe the other day, and they both picked 12. And I said, you guys, this is rigged, Okay, so let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 right here. And I am not going to give away the whole email. Obviously, I cannot give, excuse me, the handle for the whole email, but the email is SDLILDER. So SDildeer, I think,
Okay.
is something like that. Let me see if I can actually put it on the screen to make it easy for them to identify this. And I'm just going to edit, Peter, your let's see. Okay, so this person has to comment. Remember, you have to comment in order to win. So it
Ooh.
is SD Little Deer. I think that's SD Little Deer. That is should be on the screen right now in 3, 2, 1. Let's see. There you go. It's right there. SD little deer. Let's see if he shows up. That's me. It says Fawn Hadlock. That's you, Fawn. He's watching us from YouTube. Well, congratulations. We're gonna give him a.
Awesome.
There you go. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Fawn, I will be emailing you. You're gonna give me your address, and we're gonna give you a copy of Myths and Mistakes by Dr. Peter Gurry. Peter, it's been a pleasure, man. It's a lot of fun to do this. We actually ate up almost the 2 hours that we had set for this. I mean, the first hour, I just wanted to continue to ask you questions, man. This what you do is so important, and it's so much fun, at least for us that enjoy this sort of thing. Like I said, me and you were talking about Dan earlier, and I can sit down and just listen to you guys forever, man.
No, it's fascinating. It is.
Yeah, it's good stuff, and like you said, it's one of the things. And Hugh, something that you say really resonated with me, and it's similar to something that Dr. Hugh Ross says the other day. He says, in which area of apologetics, he says, can you wake up in the evidence for the case for the existence of a creator, increases exponentially every day. He says, I have to update my creator in Cosmos every so many years, because there's so much new evidence to be added to the case. And in your case, it seems to be a similar thing that happens when you guys are finding new manuscripts or putting into all this work. You got this technology. I know Dan, you and Dan and the people from the CSNTM go and got these machines that digitize these manuscripts in such an amazing way. You're working with this method now where you actually have computers helping you put together this information, letting you know what this family belongs to, this manuscript belongs here, and how they relate to each other, and all of that is just amazing, man. So well, it's great to have you, man. Look forward to have you again.
Yeah, it's been great.
You and John can jump on board together one of these days, and we'll pick a couple of cool topics and have you guys tell us more about the Text and Canon Institute, and maybe give us a rundown on how people can apply and how people can stay in touch and all that sort of things. And we want to tell people, make sure that you go to the Sacred Words Conference. I'm going to pull it up right here. Let me see. Sacred Words Conference is happening, and I want to get the right days. So I'm going to come here. It's February. Let's see. There you go. Friday, February 21st, and Saturday, February 22nd. You say weather is beautiful down there.
It was 60 degrees here today, Jorge.
Yeah, absolutely. So and then we're going to have
sunny.
And sunny, yeah.
And sunny.
I love it, man. I love it. We had about a 40-degree morning here in South Carolina, so still pretty warm here, but not down there.
It's the only time of the year where we feel better than the rest of the country in Arizona.
Right. Because then you guys just go outside and melt.
We gotta enjoy it while we have it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, God is good, man. He gives you that break. That's right. Well, Dan Wallace, Peter Gentry, and Stephen Dempster, they're gonna be down there. Breakout speakers, we got Kate, Lockett, Ferguson, Mitchell, all in the realm of the history of the Bible. We're 21st and 22nd tickets you can buy right now for $30.
Yep.
And this is a conference geared towards the church.
Yep.
Anybody you don't need any background expertise on anything.
No, this is not for academics. So.
Right, not for academics. Now also you blog at evangelical textual criticism.blogspot.com. You do need a little bit of knowledge when you come here, but if you want to know what's up with but in the field, what's happening, then this is where you're gonna go. If you want to dig deep into textual criticism directly from Dan Wallace's, and I'm just going to do a refresh here. Directly from Dan Wallace, we have this New Testament textual criticism course going live in 2 days. So make sure you go to onlinechristiancourses.com. Super simple URL, onlinechristiancourses.com. And you can come to, it was ps.edu/TCI.
Yep.
And you can come to the Text and Canon Institute to learn more about this. And that's it, man. I mean, we had a great show. We had we gave away a book. We learned tons from you, man. May God continue to bless you in your work, and look forward to bump into you in some conferences. Hopefully, I can come visit you guys down there, and we can have some fun. Maybe do some filming.
Yeah.
And Lord willing, we'll be praying that the Sacred Words Conference is a very successful conference, so you guys can continue to do this. I think that whatever you guys are doing or you're going to be doing in the future is going to be invaluable, man.
That's great. Thanks so much, Jorge, for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for watching. And this is the Cross Examine live show, and I'm Jorge Gil, the Executive Director for Cross Examine, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.